gather information and provide it to our flight crews in a non-hostile environment. You'll be flying into this airfield. This is what it looks like. Here's the trees at the end of the runway you need to watch out for. The government seems to be a little bit unstable in this South American country. Be careful if you go off base. Those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've seen in the courses I took doesn't really lead us into something in that kind of a clandestine nature. The document that was found in the National Archives based on supposedly this series of postcards was not in the box. It was not where it should have been. It was in a box where it shouldn't have been. This box was reviewed by I think military officers, but people with security clearances who had the authority to remove anything that was not releasable into the general population. They somehow missed this document. It was not in a folder. It was not where it should have been. And if you talk to the people at the National Archives, which I have done, I've had communication with those people a number of times and been there to look at all these sorts of things. Their opinion is that it was a document planted there. And Stan's belief is it was planted there by someone on MJ-12 who wanted the information released, and in that sense it's authentic. My belief it was planted there by someone who wanted to keep the myth of MJ-12 going,
mm-hmm.
and in that sense is not authentic. And I know, once again, this does not make me a popular person in the field of ufology because I do not embrace MJ-12.
And you mentioned someone from Hollywood, and that is kind of the tidbit that I was reaching for here, because again, the Cutler-Twining memo is from, well, it was found, or however you want to term that, then around in 1985, or that's when they began receiving these postcards and so forth, and one of the messages in there were Reese's Pieces. Well, it turns out that in the film E.T., this by Spielberg, there is a product placement for the product Reese's Pieces, and that's released in 1982. So just, what does that have to do with anything? Is it internal little hint that it's a fake message, if you know what I mean? It's a product placement, so to speak.
The people who created MJ-12, the fakers who invented the myth, also placed on the document Donald Menzel, who was the great UFO debunker from Harvard University, the UFO denier, if you will. And Stan did a lot of research into Menzel's background and found out during World War II he had a very high security clearance and was involved in cryptoanalysis for the United States government. Well, gee whiz, during World War II, wasn't practically everybody in the United States involved in the war effort in some fashion? I mean, wasn't everybody in the entire world basically involved in the war in some way?
Yeah.
Whether it was on one side or the other. So, I mean, the fact that Menzel, whose background was mathematics and physics, was involved in this thing is not surprising whatsoever. It doesn't lead you to MJ-12. And that may be sort of an inside joke. Menzel, the great UFO denier, was really one of the insiders who knew the absolute truth. But Stan has been through Menzel's papers and found absolutely no hint of MJ-12. What we'd like to see is somebody find some document with a provenance that mentions MJ-12 that clearly is clearly not bogus, and it has not been done in more than 20, 25, 30 years of search for this sort of thing. I would love nothing better for the documents to have been authentic, because then we can stop arguing about the reality of UFOs and move on to the question of who are they, where do they come from, what do they want. We'll start arguing about whether or not the UFOs are interstellar craft or not, and we haven't been able to get to the more important questions that we should be looking at. So
do you think that this was potentially the purpose then for the hoaxing as well, to kind of just put more, if you will, then disinformation, that it's kind of, it is enough credible, so to speak, to get people's attention going or interest going, but at the same time, it's not enough. It's not good enough, so to speak, to verify its existence. And maybe that's the point too, to keep people fighting over these kinds of documents and not really moving forward, so to speak.
Well, the thing with the documents, you can look at them as disinformation, and if you're doing disinformation, which is something you put together to lead people astray, and you have to include enough good information in there that they'll believe the entirety of the information, so that when a little bit of it is discredited, you discredit everything. The purpose of disinformation is to do that. I don't think that was the purpose behind it, although there are many people in the UFO community who believe that. I believe that the MJ-12 documents were designed specifically to propel specific people back into the spotlight and hold their place there. Bill Moore himself, in something he and Jamie Chandray had produced in the 1990s, suggested that the documents were fake.
Well, okay, so what is the extension of this and the program here that we're talking about? There's a number of things that have seemed to spawn out of these various groups. We have things called Project Blue Book, then, for instance. We have Project Sign, Project Grudge. There are a number of these around. Are they all connected in some way, Kevin, or is one standing alone from the other, and is one more valid than the other in terms of your research?
When you look at the UFO history, you find out that in 1947, when the UFO sightings began in the United States and the military was called on to look into this stuff, General Twining, who was at Wright Field at the time, the commander of the Air Materiel Command, suggested in September of 1947 that a classified project be started to investigate UFO sightings, which was Project Sign. So that's a legitimate military investigation. At the same time, they said the code name was Project Saucer. Well, that was the civilian name, and if you were on the outside, you talked about Project Saucer. If you were on the inside, you knew it was Project Sign. This was a legitimate military investigation of UFOs. In 1949, I think it was 1949, the name Sign was compromised. It got out into the public arena. Project Sign was a real investigation. The name was changed to Project Grudge. So Project Grudge was an investigation, although it wasn't a very good investigation. They now were of the attitude that there was nothing to this. They were going through the motions. Nobody really cared. One of the generals at the Pentagon in 1951, I believe it was, wanted to know whatever happened to that UFO investigation, the flying saucer investigation, was told what was happening. He said, well, that's not right. He revitalized it, appointed Ed Ruppelt to be the chief of the project. They changed the code name to Project Blue Book. Ruppelt started another legitimate investigation of UFOs. After he left his position, it went through a number of different commanders, ending up with Hector Quintanilla, who was the last chief of Project Blue Book, and he closed it out in 1969. But by the time we get into the 60s, it's more of a public relations outfit rather than an investigative outfit. So in that respect, it wasn't really legitimate. It was just answering the public's queries about UFOs, and the Air Force wanted to get rid of Project Blue Book, but they couldn't find a politically expedient way of doing it, which gave rise to the Condon Committee at the University of Colorado, which was the so-called scientific investigation of UFOs. And their job was to determine there was no national security interests in investigating UFOs, and they could close Project Blue Book without endangering national security, which is exactly what they did. Condon, in fact, 18 months before the end of the project, was in Corning, New York, saying to a group of scientists, well, I'd be inclined to tell them right now there's nothing to this thing, but I'm not supposed to discover that answer for another 18 months. There's a hell of a fine scientific investigation. We already know what the answer is, and we're now just looking for the evidence to take us there. And in fact, in 1968, there was the, and I believe legitimate event in Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia, in Canada, of something seen falling into the water, which involved an investigation by the Canadian military, the Mounties, and I think the U.S. had some investigators in there as well. The Condon Committee called up to Canada, asked a couple of questions, were told that, well, there were some teenagers thought they saw something, and the Condon Committee let it go. Their job was to investigate UFOs. Here's something that's fallen into the lake. There's all kinds of witnesses to it, and they don't even bother to send an investigator to look at it. So how good could their investigation be?